Before we begin, this episode contains descriptions of medieval religious practices, including extreme asceticism, bodily mortification, and discussions of plague death. If you're listening with young children or are sensitive to these topics, please take care. In the year 1344, a woman sat alone in a small stone house near the monastery of Alvastra on the eastern shore of Lake Vättern. She was a widow, she was a mother of 8, she was 41 years old, and she had just buried her husband. His name was Ulf Gudmarsson, and they had been married for 28 years. They had made a pilgrimage together to Santiago de Compostela. They had taken vows together to dedicate their remaining years to God, and now he was gone. In the weeks after Ulf's death, something happened to this woman that would change Sweden forever. She began to hear a voice. Not an inner voice, not a metaphor, a voice, clear, direct, unmistakable. The voice claimed to be Christ, and it called her my bride. It gave her a mission: found a new religious order, reform the church, speak truth to power, and it told her that everything she said, every word she dictated, every letter she wrote, every demand she made to popes and kings carried divine authority. She was terrified. She was also obedient. And for the next 29 years until her death in Rome in 1373, Birgitta Birgersdotter would do exactly what that voice told her to do. By the time she was finished, she had dictated over 600 celestial revelations. She had founded a monastic order that still exists today. She had helped create the written Swedish language. She had lectured popes, rebuked kings, and tried to broker peace in the Hundred Years' War. And she had become one of the most influential women in medieval European history, all while bearing 2 of her children during the Black Death. This is the story of Saint Birgitta of Sweden, the mystic, the mother, the law speaker for God. To understand Birgitta, you have to understand the house she grew up in. It wasn't a convent. It wasn't a quiet, pious household of prayer and contemplation. It was the house of the lagman, the law speaker. In medieval Sweden, the law speaker is one of the most powerful figures in the land. He was the living memory of the law. He didn't just interpret it. He was it. At the thing, remember we spoke about that in several episodes. That's the assembly that made decisions. At the thing, the law speaker would stand and recite the entire law code from memory, every statute, every precedent, every fine and penalty and procedure. Hours of reciting, perfect recall, the law was not written down. It lived in the law speaker's voice. Birgitta's father was Birger Persson, the law speaker of Uppland. He was one of the wealthiest landowners in Sweden. He helped compile the Uppland Law, one of the first Swedish law codes to be written down. He was a man who understood that words were weapons, that the right phrase, the right precedent, and the right argument could change reality. Birgitta grew up in that house. She absorbed that understanding. And when she began to have her visions, she didn't describe them as fuzzy, mystical dreams. She framed them as legal verdicts. The scholar Claire Solin has written about this. Birgitta's revelations read less like poetry and more like court rulings. Christ is the judge. Birgitta is the court reporter, and the sentences she delivers to kings, to bishops, and to popes carried the full weight of divine law. She was not just a mystic. She was a law speaker for God. She was born in 1303 in Finsta in Uppland. Her mother, Ingeborg Birgersdotter, came from an equally powerful family. Birgitta was related to the royal line on her mother's side. She was raised for power. Her first vision came at age 7. She saw a lady in shining clothes standing at an altar, offering her a crown. At age 10, she saw the crucified Christ, his wounds bleeding, his eyes looking directly into hers. She wept for weeks afterward. But she was not allowed to pursue a life of the Spirit. Not yet. She had a noble daughter's duty to fulfill. At 13, she was married to Ulf Gunmarsson, a nobleman from Västergötland. She would spend the next 28 years as the Lady of Ulvastra. managing one of the largest estates in Sweden. She raised 8 children, 4 sons, 4 daughters. She managed the finances. She managed the servants. She navigated complex politics of the Swedish court, where she served as lead advisor to the young king Magnus Eriksson and his queen, Blanche of Namur. And underneath the silk robes, she was reportedly living a life of secret penance. Fasting, prayer, small acts of self denial that no one else could see. This was the middle life of Birgitta Birgersdotter, the noblewoman, the estate manager, the mother. But the ground underneath was shifting. In 1341, Birgitta and Ulf made a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, the great shrine of St. James in northwestern Spain. It was a brutal journey, 1,000 miles on foot and horseback, months of travel through unpredictable weather, rough terrain, and the constant threat of illness. On the return journey, Ulf fell gravely ill. Birgitta prayed desperately. According to her own account, a vision of Saint Dionysius appeared to her and assured her that Ulf would recover. He did. They made a vow together. If Ulf survived, they would dedicate the rest of their lives to God. Ulf would enter a monastery as a lay brother. Birgitta would live nearby as a religious woman. Ulf entered to the Cistercian monastery at Alvastra. He died within a few years. Birgitta was 41, a widow, alone. She didn't remarry. She didn't return to her family's estate. She moved to a small stone house near the monastery and began to write. And the voice that came to her there changed everything. You shall be my bride and my mouthpiece. That is what Christ told her. Not a request, a command. And for the next 29 years, Birgitta would dictate over 600 revelations, the celestial revelations. They covered everything: theology, politics, the fate of individual souls, the corruption of the church, the duties of the kings, the architecture of monasteries, the proper behavior for nuns, the torments of purgatory, and the joys of heaven. They were vivid, sometimes terrifying: Christ bleeding on the cross, souls burning in hell, the Virgin Mary weeping over the sins of the world. But they were also practical, legal, precise. The daughter of the law speaker was dictating rules from the highest court of all. And there's something remarkable, something most people don't know. She dictated in Old Swedish. In the 14th century, Swedish was not a written literary language. It was spoken. It was used for runestones and legal documents and a handful of religious fragments. But the language of literature, of theology, of serious intellectual discourse, that was Latin. Brigitta didn't care. She dictated her visions in her native tongue. Her confessors, Master Matthias, prior of Alvestra, and later her daughter Catherine translated them into Latin. And in doing so, Brigitta became the first great writer in the Swedish language. The linguist Lars Folin at Uppsala University has argued that Brigitta's prose style is the deep foundation of the Swedish literary tradition. Before her, there was no model for how to write complex, expressive theological Swedish. She created it. She stabilized it. She gave the language a written form that would influence everything that followed. She is one of the mothers of the Swedish tongue. But there's a catch. The Latin translations may have sanded down some of her rough edges. Scholars like Arne Jonsson at Lund University and Claire Solin have noted that Brigitta's male translations often softened her voice in the Latin versions, made her more theologically conventional, more courteous, more acceptable. The original Swedish, they suspect, was sharper, more direct, more accusatory, the voice of the law speaker's daughter delivering verdicts. We'll never fully know what was lost in translation, but the glimpses we've have, the surviving old Swedish fragments, the places where her voice breaks through the polished Latin, suggest a woman who was not asking politely. She was telling the world what God wanted, and she expected to be obeyed. Birgitta didn't stay at Alvastra. Her visions pushed her outward, toward the court, toward the king, toward power. She had been lady in waiting to Queen Blanche. She knew the young king, Magnus Eriksson, well. She had watched him rule. And now, with the voice of Christ behind her, she began to tell him exactly what he was doing wrong. In one revelation, Christ speaks through Birgitta and says, Magnus is playing like a child playing with a knife. He does not know how to rule. In another, she criticizes his military failures, his sexual morality, his mismanagement of the kingdom's finances. She was not subtle. She was not courteous. She was a widow from the provinces, and she was telling the king of Sweden that God was angry with him. And then she made a demand. Christ, she said, had commanded her to found a new religious order, a double monastery. That's one where nuns and monks live in the same complex. They share a single church, separated by strict walls. The abbess would have supreme authority, not the abbot, not the bishop, the abbess. And Christ, she said, had chosen the location as Vadstena, a royal estate on the shores of Lake Vättern. She essentially demanded that Magnus hand over one of the crown's most valuable properties and warned him of divine punishment if he refused. Magnus granted the land in 1346. It was one of the largest royal grants in medieval Swedish history, and it was made to a widow who had no army, no political office, and no formal power whatsoever, except the power of a voice she claimed was God's. Was she sincere? Was she a true mystic receiving genuine revelations from the divine? Or was she a brilliant political operator, using the language of visions to get what she wanted? The answer is probably both. Faith and power were not separate categories in the 14th century. They were woven together. Birgitta could have genuinely believed she was speaking for Christ and also understand exactly how much leverage that gave her. There's a deeper point here, one that connects Birgitta to something fundamentally Swedish. She was the first person in Swedish history to successfully argue, publicly and persistently, that a king was not above the law, that even the most powerful men must answer to a higher standard of justice. Centuries later, Sweden would create the office of the Ombudsman. That's an independent official who investigates complaints against the government. The word is Swedish. The concept that power must be accountable is now used around the world. It was formally created in 1809, but the seed of it was planted by Birgitta Birgersdotter in the 1340s, a woman who looked at a king and told him he was failing and got away with it. In 1349, Birgitta left Sweden. The Black Death had arrived. Her daughter Märta and her son Karl would both die during the pandemic. Birgitta would never see Sweden again. She went to Rome, the eternal city, the heart of Christendom, and when she arrived, she found it in ruins. The papacy had been in Avignon in southern France since 1309. 7 popes in a row had ruled from there. Under the heavy influence of the French crown, Rome was decaying. The Lateran Basilica was crumbling. The population had collapsed. The city was a backwater. Birgitta spent the next 23 years in Rome, poor, foreign, female, and became one of the loudest voices in Europe demanding that the Pope return. She wrote letter after letter to the Avignon popes. She called them traitors to Christ. She described visions of their souls burning in purgatory. She warned them of divine punishment if they did not return to the tomb of St. Peter. She also did the quiet work, feeding the poor, nursing the sick, building a reputation for holiness that made her harder to dismiss. And she practiced an extreme bodily asceticism that is difficult to read about even now. She dripped burning candle wax onto her arms to remind herself of Christ's wounds. She would reopen the wounds before they healed to keep the pain fresh. She chewed bitter root constantly as a punishment for ever having enjoyed food. She knelt for hours on cold stone floors of Roman churches, praying and weeping. This was not performative. She did much of it in private, but it shaped her authority. She was not just speaking for Christ, she was suffering with him. At nearly 70 years old, she made the grueling pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The ship was nearly wrecked in a storm. Her son Karl became entangled in a scandalous romance with the Queen Joanna of Naples. Birgitta was devastated. But in the Holy Land, she dictated some of her most powerful visions: the Nativity, the Passion, the grief of the Virgin, her vision of the birth of Christ, Mary kneeling before the radiant infant Jesus, who lay on the bare ground glowing with light, would reshape Christian art for centuries. You can trace that image through medieval and Renaissance painting. The kneeling Virgin, the baby on the ground, the light. That's Birgitta. She died in Rome on July 23rd, 1373. Her body was carried back to Sweden the following year, stopping at monasteries and churches along the way, drawing crowds of mourners. She was interred at Vadstena Abbey, the monastery she had designed. Her daughter Catherine led the campaign for her canonization. She traveled to Rome, she lobbied the Pope, she gathered testimonies, she pushed the process through. Gitta was canonized in 1391, only 18 years after her death, unusually fast. The Brigittine Order, the Order of the Most Holy Savior, was founded at Vadstena. It was a double monastery, nuns and monks living in separate quarters, sharing a single church. The abbess held supreme authority. This was revolutionary. No other major order gave a woman final decision-making power over both men and women. The order spread across Europe. At its height, there were over 70 Brigittine houses, from England to Estonia, from Germany to the Netherlands. The order still exists today. There are Brigittine convents in Sweden, England, the Netherlands, India, Mexico, and elsewhere. Messina Abbey became the center of learning, manuscript production, and spiritual life in late medieval Scandinavia. Birgitta's Revelations was one of the most widely read books in medieval Europe. Translations circulated in Latin, Middle English, German, Dutch, and other languages. And then there's the aesthetic legacy. Brigitta's design specifications for Vestina were unusually specific. Plain stone, no ornate carvings, no gold leaf, no distractions. She wanted the church to be, in her words, humble and strong. Some scholars see this as one of the deep roots of Swedish minimalist design: the clean lines, the focus on light and function, the rejection of unnecessary decoration. You can trace a line, long, winding, series-long line from Vestina Abbey to the modern Swedish aesthetic, from Birgitta's plain stone church to the clean wood of a Scandinavian living room. It's a playful argument, but there's something to it. The first great Swedish visionary didn't want gold and ornament. She wanted light. She wanted space. She wanted silence. That's still what we want. In 1999, Pope John Paul II declared Birgitta one of the patron saints of Europe. She shares that honor with only 5 others. In 2014, a research team led by Anna Shellstrom conducted DNA analysis of the bones and the red velvet casket at Vestina Abbey. The results confirmed that the remains are consistent with Birgitta and her daughter, Catherine, who was also buried alongside her. The ground confirmed the legend. I want you to sit with her for a moment. Not the saint in the icon, not the serene woman with her eyes turned towards heaven, the other Birgitta, the older woman, the one whose face was etched with exhaustion, the one who buried her 2 children during a plague and kept speaking, the one who dripped burning wax onto her arms and wept on cold stone, the one who looked at the most powerful men in the world and told them without hesitation that they were failing. She was not an easy woman. She was not always likable. She was fierce. She was demanding. She was utterly convinced that she spoke for God. And in a century where women's voices were rarely heard in public, she made herself heard. She helped create the Swedish language. She designed a monastery that still stands. She built an order that still exists. She set a precedent that power must be accountable. She left behind over 600 visions that people are still reading, still arguing about, and still trying to understand. There's something in her story about grief and purpose, about the refusal to be silenced by suffering, about what happens when someone decides that their voice matters and acts like it. The woman in the icon is a saint. But the woman in the ground, she was a revolutionary. If this episode moved you, please share it with someone who loves history. And if you haven't already, follow the show so you don't miss what comes next. Next time on Beyond the Swedish Postcard, we return to Gotland. It's 1361, just 11 years after the Black Death. A Danish king named Valdemar sails into Visby with a professional army. What happens next is one of the most brutal battles in Scandinavian history. The mass graves outside the city walls, the farmers slaughtered in the hundreds, the skeletons still wearing their chainmail. And the mystery? Did Visby really fill 3 barrels of gold to save itself? That's next time. Until then, keep looking beyond the Swedish postcard.